Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the next edition of Observer Research Foundation's Wednesday webinar. The COVID pandemic has exposed the cracks and vulnerabilities of cities, and the most vulnerable areas, the slums, the informal areas, sit right ahead in this whole debate. There are large informal economies that feed into the larger fiscal pie of this country, and yet they are the most ignored. The truth is, when we talk of slums, we think redevelopment, we think of land banks, and not livelihoods and social problems. There is a need for reversal in this thinking. But how? Today's ORF Wednesday webinar is all about discussing this reversal. Reimagining slums post COVID will aim at talking to four very distinct experts who will come up with solutions that could help derive a comprehensive framework to look at these informalities. In the next 1 hour, we will attempt to arrive at innovative and inclusive solutions to slums. Those which will not compromise on the quality of life and livelihoods of people and will aim at creating better homes, environment, and infrastructure for slum dwellers. Let me do a quick introduction of the panelists. First, we have Dr. Amita Bhide. Dr. Bhide is a professor and dean of School of Habitat Studies, Tata Institute of Social Sciences in Mumbai. She has over 2 decades of work experience under her belt, and she also heads a very interesting program in the M East ward, which is a very poor and high density ward in Mumbai, and leads the social and economic transformation program there. Dr. Ramanath Jha is a distinguished fellow at the Observer Research Foundation in Mumbai, a former administrator who headed the Mumbai Metropolitan Regional Development Authority, the MMRDA, the Pune Municipal Corporation. He currently works on issues of urban sustainability, urban governance, and urban planning. He has actually, led the whole Mumbai Development Plan program of 2034 and thus brings a huge experience to today's debate. Dr. Priya Deshankar is a professor of migration and development at the School of Global Studies, University of Sussex, an internationally recognized authority on international migration, research and policy analysis. Deshankar has played a key role in influencing the global policy discourse on internal migration and development. She is currently advising the Indian Ministry of Urban Affairs on migration-related issues in the wake of COVID-19. Dr. Pedro Ortiz is a senior urban planner and international consultant and a senior fellow at the New York University's Marin Institute. He is a former elected mayor for Madrid's Central District and has authored the Regional Development Plan of Madrid of 1996 as well as the Land Planning Law of 1997. A few housekeeping rules before we begin this session. The panel discussion will go on for 50 minutes, 50, leaving 25 minutes for Q&A. I would request you to type your questions with your names into the Q&A box only. The chat box can be used for other comments. So I will be picking up the questions which only reflect in the Q&A box. So without waiting any further, let's begin and let's start talking about how slums should be handled post-COVID. Let us start with Dr. Bhide. Dr. Bhide, your ground level work is in most complicated slum settlements, and you have huge knowledge about slums academically as well. How do you think we should be addressing the problems of these highly dense informal areas, or what is commonly referred to as slumification? Can you tell us a little bit about this?
Thank you, Saili, and thank you to ORF as well. What I'll start with and very quickly is to talk about the concept of slums more than perhaps first talking about problems within. And I think if we begin to trace how slums have been defined, particularly in Mumbai, but also in the country at large, then one begins to say that in the 1950s, slums were largely defined as on the basis of morality and for the risk that they pose to public health within and then outside to the city, larger city as well. Today, one sees that whether it is the census definition or and the definition which is used in the Slum Rehabilitation Act of Mumbai, this definition has become much more aesthetics oriented. The country definition has become much more of a legal, jurisdictional kind of a concept, right? And becoming a juridical concept, administrative concepts, has several implications. What it means is that a slum is an imposed category by the state and therefore influenced by several vested interests which surround what is a slum and what is its meaning to the city at a particular point in time. So there are temporal changes. If one is thinking of, therefore, reimagining slum, I would actually say we should begin to think about demolishing this term called slum and instead begin also thinking of a basti, a settlement, an act which is of settling into the city, of consolidating footholds, of making claims over the city by settlers who are marginal. And I hope that this kind of a process, which keeps some attention to the settlers, will help us to begin to think of a settlement and as not just a place, but a place which is made by the settlers and therefore which requires and which involves their voice, their agency, consulting them before making any improvements in the place and acknowledging that agency as first the primary force which makes settlements.
Thank you, Dr. Bide, and I think it is very important that we consider this, that the attention should be given to settlers. I would like to come to Dr. Jha here. He's the architect of the development plan of Mumbai of 2034, and I would like to pose this question to him. If we are talking of settlers, we are also talking a lot about poverty planning, which covers slum and slum dwellers. So, pardon me for using that term, but yes. So, how do you think, Dr. Jha, should city planners be more mindful about these concepts and take into account the dynamic nature of, settlements and settlers?
Thanks, Hailey. When you sit down to do a plan, generally you divide it very broadly into three categories. You start with the economy because that's the most important thing in the city. Everyone who comes to the city is in search of employment, of business. So the economy is a vital ingredient with which a city starts. Then you have the environment, which essentially means that you provide all those who are working in the city a quality of life, and a quality of life which will enable them to be more productive and active in the city and contribute to the economy. The third angle, and which is the most relevant for us at the moment, is the issue of equity. And this is something which gets missed out when urban planners start looking at the plan, which is this term equity essentially means that what you provide in terms of economy and employment and what you provide in terms of quality of life must be available to every constituent who works and performs in the economy. And this is something that has been missed out, and that is why we have slums in cities, because the equity aspect was not taken care of and was not built into the formal planning process that we did. Although we did not mean to leave it out, but it so happened that we had not done the details which would have provided for the poor. In fact, Dr. Bide was rightly talking about the concepts behind slums, and the census actually does a very honest definition, and it lists all kinds of things that are not available to slum dwellers. So it's a longish definition, but it's a good definition. So when you start planning, there are certain issues that you need to very carefully build into the plan. Uh, when you talk of slums, you're talking of residential shelter, and therefore housing profile, when that is developed in the plan, must see how housing would get provided for the poorer classes. You just don't have to paint a piece of land saying that this is for housing or this is for weaker sections. You have to work it out in details as to what that really means and how it would go to those who are poor and how would it become affordable to them. We'll talk about this a little more later. The second thing is that if people are going to live, if the poor are going to live in cities, they must have employment. And we know that cities revolve around the informal sector, which is the major sector in terms of employment.
Dr. Jha, we are unable to hear you. Sorry. Maybe we can come back to Dr. Jha once we are able to see him online again. One of the issues that Dr. Jha actually raised was the issue of missed constituents. And I think one of the constituents that is definitely missed, and vivid descriptions of these constituents that we saw during COVID were migrants who were waiting at stations, walking back to their hometowns. So I would like to ask Dr. Deshankar, who actually has done a lot of work on migrants, on how should we see the problem of migrants and their circumstances with relation to slum post the stage of COVID. How should we look at that?
Okay, first of all, rather than calling it the problem of migration, let's say the problems that migrants face.
Yeah, sorry.
So
okay.
I would say that from a migrant's perspective, we need to look at the whole continuum of possibilities of deprivation and vulnerability and insecurity of settlements. So it's not just a black and white picture of the slum versus the settled city or the built up city, but actually, a wide variety of arrangements that migrants live and work in urban areas. So they may live actually in slums, but they also may live on the pavement. They may live at their places of work, like construction workers and people working in small dhabas and restaurants. They may even sleep on their rickshaws, like rickshaw pullers. So what we need to really think about is to think about it much more broadly. It's not just migrants in slums. That's just one part of their interaction with the city. So migrants, as we're now discovering more and more after the COVID fiasco, have been coming to cities to work in a variety of low-paid occupations. I mean, I'm focusing on low-paid occupations and historically excluded communities of people, because these are the people who work in these low-paid occupations, because we're talking about slums and informal settlements. Now, they work in all kinds of low-paid and insecure jobs. And most of them come from these socially and economically excluded communities who have been historically excluded in the kind of development profile of India. And one of the reasons we see the sort of reproduction of this pattern constantly is the kind of model of development that's being followed in India. We very much rely on a precarious workforce. People who can be hired and fired at will. So this is the kind of sort of transient or circulating workforce that we see. But of course, there are other kinds of migrants in the city who've been there for a long time or a long period of time, who may still be in very precarious accommodation. They may be pavement dwellers for decades. So there are a variety of arrangements that we have to think about in this discussion. What I want to draw attention to here is that migrants are hyper precarious in the way that they live and work. And there's three reasons for that. One is their lack of citizenship documents. They can't easily prove that they are citizens of India. And this has been noted by a number of studies on the ground with migrant workers in cities. You know, they have a big problem with establishing their credentials to call themselves Indian citizens. And that excludes them from all kinds of benefits and programs and help that is being set up for migrants, even in the area of housing. Secondly is their informal work. So their contracts are precarious and insecure. And then thirdly is that they are working in a system of servitude and social relations that have literally been reproduced in urban areas based on the way that they function in rural areas. So the kinds of social relations that determine the exploitation and extractive work patterns that a lot of poorer migrants are seen in is based on historical patterns of work and servitude. So the combination of all of these things makes migrants hyper precarious. And that's certainly one thing to consider here when we talk about making cities more inclusive or improving slums. You know, these patterns are reproduced everywhere, not just in work, but also in the allocation of housing or any other kind of program that's set up for them. There are social relations that play out everywhere, and we need to think about those. And as the last point I want to make here, maybe I'm taking up too much time right now, is
No,
that
you're good.
the scale of this, you know, that we simply do not know how many migrants there are, and there are all kinds of numbers being thrown around, which are wildly varying, you know, from each other. So some people say there are 30 million migrants in urban areas, interstate migrants, and you know there are bigger estimates. I don't want to start getting into numbers and how people arrive at those figures, including myself, but I just want to highlight the fact that we really don't know, and you know, we need to make a serious effort, because that is linked with all of those issues that I just highlighted of hyper precarities. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Deshankar. I think she really brought out some important aspects of migrants. That takes me to the next question to Dr. Ortiz. Dr. Ortiz, you've often spoken of this huge explosion of urban growth and establishment of metropolitan megapolises. And so I was just wondering that where does an informal area like a slum, or where do hyper precarious migrants really feature in what is known as a holistic inclusive approach of metropolitan planning? Where do they fall in there?
Well, thank you so much, Saili. Well, thank you for the invitation, first of all. And let me say that I am very honored, but I am a little bit awkward because I am not specialist in slums,
Yes.
not even in housing. I deal with the overall metropolises, which is a new dimension, different from urban. No? And metropolis
Yes.
have to be run like countries rather than cities, because they are as powerful as countries. To give an example, Mumbai GDP is equal to Pakistan. So really, you must run Mumbai as a whole country, and I can give you many more examples of that. So when you are dealing with this kind of dimension, you realize that slum is not a problem of the location of the quality of the housing. It's a problem of governance, it's a problem of provision of social facilities, of the economics, and then obviously the physical as well. And housing is just part of that physical, because you have transport, you have environment, and so on and so on. So really, slums, you cannot address slums just like slums. I'm sorry for the comment, or marginal settlements, or informal settlements, or uncontrolled settlements that we generally use to define them. So you have to deal with them with those aspects of governance and economics and social and so on. And then let me say that the problem is informality in all these aspects. It's not only informality in the land or in the housing, it's in all these aspects. And informality that is here to stay, and we have to learn how to deal with it. Informality is the inability of the government to produce the goods and the frame that people need. No, If you don't have that capacity to produce jobs in a formal economy, then you have people that have to live and create the informal economy. If you don't have governance, if you are not able to produce the services the government has to provide, security and so on, you have mafias that will do it for you. If you don't have the capacity to provide social services, those social services would be provided informally by the local family or the group or whatever, and housing as well. We are dealing a huge problem because to give figures, general figures, when you produce every day of the year, more or less 1 hectare of land, informal land, per million inhabitants. 1 hectare per million inhabitants. So take your city, multiply by the number of million inhabitants, and that is what is done every day. Guadalajara, 6 million. In Mexico, that's 7 hectares every day. And if the government is not able to provide the land in the right location and in a formal way with the service, all service, water provision, sewage, and so on, that people have to live. So they will build whatever they can. And generally places where you don't sit, because if the government sees that they are building somewhere significant, they will intervene. So it's really repressing and controlling that, because the government is not able to provide the goods they have to provide. No? We call this informality the Peter Pan syndrome, because as you know, Peter Pan could not control his shadow, his informality, the informal economy, the informal housing, could not control the shadow, and he could not grow because he could not control the shadow. And then I'm going into finance, because if government cannot control the shadow, where the shadow in some countries is 70% of the economy, you cannot develop with just 30% of the economy. Taxing 30% of the economy, providing goods for 30%, you have to provide for everyone. So if you don't control, if you are not able to dialogue with that informality, you are never going to grow. And to give an example, which is striking, normally developed countries, the public sector is 30%, from 30 to 50% of the economy. No, the United States is 37%, Germany is 46%, France is 56%, France has gone too far. No? India is 13%. India, with an economy, with a public economy of 13%, will never be able to be a developed country, because the government cannot provide all the goods the people need, the land and so on. So politicians, when they see that they are not able, what they don't want to see is the figures. So the figures I am giving you of 1 hectare every day per million inhabitants, the politicians don't want to hear about it, because they know they are not going to be able to provide that land. So they prefer not to hear about it. And then they divert the interest and they lie and so on and so on. And as this problem goes on growing, they think that it's not on my terms of office, it will be the next one who has to solve it. But we must realize that when we do not deal with that need, daily need, yearly need of slums, we are producing a problem where, well, we are producing a problem because of our inability, that the cost, and this is figures from UN Habitat and from the World Bank, the cost of upgrading a slum is from 3 to 9 times more than doing it right, providing the service lands from the beginning. So by not being able to provide that service land, and saying, no, we don't have the money, we don't have the capacity, we are multiplying from 3 to 9 times the problem in the future. And that is what will impede any country with that kind of inability to address these problems to develop in the future.
Thank you, Pedro. Very interesting numbers from a planning point of view, I guess, and from your city studies that you have done across India. I'd like to come back to Dr. Bhide. I'm sure she will have something to reflect on what Pedro has said, because you've been working in several slums in Mumbai, including M East and Dharavi. How do we deal with the vulnerabilities of these informal settlements, and yet ensure that the inclusivity factor really stays in that is what I wanted to ask you actually.
I had again, 2, 3 reflections, both
Oh,
from
sure, please.
what Dr. Deshinkar said and Dr. Ortiz is saying.
Yeah.
So one is, I think, the meaning contained within these vulnerabilities and even what we know as a slum, it's constant, it's dynamic, and it changes over a period of time. Okay? Uh, so let's say the slum of the 70s in Mumbai is not the slum of today that one is seeing. Okay? And I'm making this point because the nature of vulnerability changes, constantly changes. At one point in time, we recognized slums as really those inclusive housing solutions for the most uh, poorest of the people, most vulnerable people. In fact, we have done oral histories in Ennis Ward, and some of these oral histories tell us that even while the creation of settlements has involved um, a whole lot of intermediaries and politicians or informal landlords per se and those kind of processes, but it has also involved a substantial amount of non-propertied, non-commodified claim making. Okay? So women, very poor migrants, single women who have been able to make their homes, okay, due to favors granted by the bhais or the dadas or what today are called slumlords. Okay? And we have several such stories which are gathered. Okay? But this was in the 70s. Okay? If you look at the nature of those very settlements today, you will see that the most recent migrants, in fact, are so doubly, triply marginalized and made more vulnerable because they are controlled in every way by different kinds of informal service providers. So it is now not just housing which is provided through a mafia kind of uh, I would say providers, but it is water which will come from them. It is cable networks which will come from them. Their employment often is also controlled, right? And therefore, the kind of agency which these people had in terms of determining the spatiality, the community-ness of those neighborhoods, all of those factors are changing today in Mumbai. In fact, I would argue that the inclusiveness of the slum in Mumbai is changing so fast, mostly because of two things. Okay? And here I have slight bit of differences with what Mr. Ortiz said, where he talked about informality as basically being a product of the failure of formal economy, formal polity to provide, and that's the space which informality occupies. To me, while the what the figures for formal economy are very true when we are talking about that, we must see that the informality is therefore also a creative process. It's a very productive process, very tension filled, but at the same time, it's a productive process, and which strives to provide solutions. It is not just dependent on the formal economy, but it creates resources as well. Okay? But at the same time, that creation has to be recognized. I think currently what is happening in Mumbai, and there is an attempt to also do this in other cities of India, is to speculate on this value and connect it to the larger city real estate markets in a very different way. So this doesn't recognize vulnerability of people. This doesn't recognize and focus attention on settlers within. In fact, what it does is it gives the formal economy an opportunity to make money out of settlements, an opportunity for politicians, in fact, to use slums as grounds of making huge amounts of premiums. Okay? And that makes settlements even more vulnerable. Okay? It's only a way of externalizing so many of the vulnerabilities which are embedded within a settlement because they don't recognize livelihoods. It is an approach which doesn't require, it only knows slum as a space. And in fact, that connects back to my earlier point when I talked about when we think about slum only through a legal juridical category or thing. I mean, typically in Mumbai today, we talk of not even defining slums. There are no more slums declared in Mumbai. What we declare is slum rehabilitation areas, clusters. Okay? So, which means that we look at slums only as space. And I think those things are problematic. When we talk of recognizing vulnerabilities, it would mean talking of all the living realities of settlers. It would mean employment, it would mean education, it would mean health, it would mean sanitation, it would mean creation of public spaces. All of these are requirements, and we are not allowing people even that tiny bit of control over their own agency. This is what linkage to formality can actually do to spaces.
Thank you, Dr. Bide. I'd like to take up from the point where Dr. Bide said that, you know, how we have been looking at slums as spaces or land banks. And coming to Dr. Jha, we lost you last time due to network availability, but maybe you would like to complete the previous point that you were making on planning. But I would like to kind of understand from you, as someone who has been an administrator, on, you know, redevelopment projects have really not succeeded, and yet governments keep pushing for them. And also financing seems to be the big elephant in the room. So what are your thoughts on, you know, new concepts of you know, rental affordable housing? And you've actually placed this thought in the new Mumbai development plan. So something on that from you.
I think a lot of issues have been raised, and a lot of very large issues have been raised. Whereas the title of the discussion that was to take place today is mainly reimagining slums post-COVID. Coming back to the topic, I think the question that you asked me, how do you reimagine COVID in terms of looking at rental housing, affordable housing, and the kind of redevelopment projects that governments have been taking in terms of slums. Firstly, one has to realize that free housing is not something that is doable. No government would be able to provide free housing by dishing out the cost, and therefore they try to do that by trading with land. But land can be traded only in cities like Mumbai, where land costs are exceptionally high. This project would not take off in 90% of the cities and towns in India. We don't need to give much thought on that. It's a scheme that has been in operation for a long time and has not been able to deliver housing to the poor. And as Dr. Bhide said, wherever they have not made it better in terms of facilities and housing quality that has been provided. It has got worse in that kind of a situation. And therefore, I would believe that redevelopment projects should be abandoned, and we should go to providing housing in a doable fashion. And if governments want to do it, then the first thing that they have to bring to the table is land, because the best models that have worked in the entire world are those where government puts it land, and therefore land cost is taken out of the equation, and the construction cost is borne by the slum dweller. For that, they are given installments, they are given soft debt, which enables them. So you calculate backwards and see what is it that would be affordable in terms of the poor being able to pay and recover the cost of construction for them. Now, if we do it in this fashion, then probably we would be able to provide housing. So any fresh housing stock that we create, affordable housing stock, has to be done in this fashion so that there are no slums that come up in the future, because no one wants slums, because slums by definition are non-livable shelters which are not fit for human habitation. So we will be able then to provide housing to people who are coming into the cities. Now, one of the things that has happened in the Indian condition is also that there are certain primate cities that have taken the entire load of the migrant population that is coming in. And in a country as large as ours, with such large populations, as Dr. Deshinkar was saying, if you load it on to only a few cities, those cities will not be able to manage the kind of population you are loading. And therefore, India needs many more viable cities, and we have to build those so that the population is decentralized into several economies across the country where people can earn a living. That is a very important thing where the government of India and the state governments come in. The other point that I would like to mention here is that if you're also looking at gender, which is such an important thing, how do women in the poorer localities, the kind of employment that we provide is very minimal. If you look at even a city like Mumbai, which has such a large economy, only about 16% of the workforce is women. So one of the things that we can do while providing affordable housing is have inbuilt employment spaces built within these housing. So if you are giving them a 400 square foot of space to live in, you could add 100 square foot of space, which is working space where women, men, children of an age where they can participate in the workforce, they then, without spending too much time going out and going in, can participate in the economic force. This is happening already. And you would find, for instance, the SRA chief, when he came to ORF, told us that the entire dhokla that is made in the country is made in Dharavi. In Mumbai is made in Dharavi and supplied to 5-star hotels. The entire leather industry of Mumbai is supported by Dharavi. And what has happened is that people live downstairs and have built a small space upstairs where they do their work. And this really integrates women into the workforce and it becomes extremely productive. So housing along with workspace is something which I would recommend. And I very strongly recommend that we have to have decentralized economies growing in hundreds of cities around the country, which can then take in migrant population and not destroy a few of the cities that are already supporting very large numbers.
Thank you, Dr. Jha. I can see Dr. Deshinkar already wanting to respond to that. But I'd also like her to, give us a sense of what she thinks about the government response on migrants, since, you've been involved post-COVID. And can you give us a sense of whether this has been holistic and whether it has looked at all the social problems that come with migration?
Okay, so that follows quite nicely from what Professor Bhide and Dr. Jha said, actually. So, I take the point that we should have, overall development and decentralized development and so on. But we do have 70 years of attempting that. We've had very generously funded rural development programs, work creation programs, agricultural programs, all sorts. But they're very complex, interlocked problems of a weak governance, a poor resource base, vulnerability to natural disasters, conflict, etc., which has driven migration and continues to drive migration. So it's not an easy issue to solve, I'd say. Of course, decentralization would solve this threat to some of the cities, as Dr. Jha said, but we also need to recognize that these cities need migrants. And this is what links to what Professor Bhide was saying. These informal settlements are sites of great innovation and economic activity, and we need to recognize their contribution to the city. In fact, even Dr. Jha said that all the dhokla comes from Dharavi. I had previously heard that all the samosas come from Dharavi, so there are so many things that are happening in these informal settlements. And they're certainly not just sites of dependency and, you know, a drain on urban resources. They are actually building the city as well, running the city as well, you know, and that recognition needs to come in. So when you asked about the government response, Sally, I'd say the government response is not based on that understanding. You know, the government response is still hidden in there, perhaps a bit toned down than it used to be in the past, is this idea that migrants need to stay back home. I mean, I know that on the other hand, they're also recognizing that industries need them, and, you know, that more sort of favorable conditions need to be created. But there is this kind of, you know, sons of the soil approach as well, where, you know, returning migrants are being asked to stay back, efforts are being made to map their skills, to create employment in the states that they've come from, like UP, Bihar, etc. I mean, what they're trying to do is to overcome huge structural problems that have driven migration, and it's not going to be a simple task. You know, and that's, it goes back to the original point I just made, which is that there are complex issues that have driven migration, and addressing those complex issues means addressing the very fabric of rural society that migrants have come from. You know, there are entrenched caste relationships, there are entrenched relationships of servitude and inequality, which are very difficult to actually overcome. You know, so if you are thinking of keeping migrants back, if you are trying to slow down, you know, the sort of flow towards certain big metropolises in the country, these are the issues that you have to deal with in a much more kind of bottom-up way than they have been dealt with so far. We need to see how government programs have performed, you know, what are the sort of, you know, what's the record? Are they actually reaching everybody that needs to be reached? And I think you'll find that most of them are, you know, mixed in their success. Even the big flagship MGNREGA, you know, there are many, many people who are not reached by these programs. And that's why we have the situation where even now, despite this increased awareness amongst government officials, migrants are still coming back. You know, they're not coming back to ideal conditions, and they may have to eat humble pie in a way, but they have no other option. You know, they may not come back to the same jobs, but they are coming back. And this is, in a way, you know, the issue. Then they're sort of excluded there, they will remain excluded in the cities unless there's a whole kind of radical rethink about all of this. I can see Dr. Jha is wanting to say something.
Dr. Jha, you can come in and then we can get Pedro to respond.
Just to further clarify, when I said that primate cities are being overburdened with migrants, it was not a statement which said that migrants should not come to cities. Migration, you know, we had this discussion in one of the last webinars that we had. Cities fuel migration, and larger cities fuel more migration. But then cities have a carrying capacity. And if you load them beyond the carrying capacity, those cities will sink. Mumbai, for all that others are saying, we know is not the same economy that it was 2 decades ago. People are moving out of Mumbai and going into the larger metropolitan region because they cannot afford to live within Mumbai. The idea is that India is a very large country, and it cannot depend merely on a handful of 6, 7 cities, which will take in the load of entire migration. And therefore, you need to have a network of cities. It does not mean that people should go back to the rural areas, because rural areas, obviously slums have not grown because rural areas have done well. As I say, slums are a consequence of national inability to control population, rural inability to generate employment, and urban inability to provide housing. That is what creates slums. So if you are going to have only Mumbai, Delhi, Calcutta, Hyderabad, Bangalore to provide migrants housing, then God be with us. We need to have many more cities. And if those economies grow, the economy would be much healthier. There would be a more decentralized kind of economy, and the nation will prosper much more.
That's what China did, right? Rural
Absolutely.
Yes.
I did not mention China because the other examples would suffice, but
Yes.
unfortunately, the only other country which is as large as us is China, and it
Yes.
has created many more cities. Extremely right.
It has. It has. Okay.
Thank you,
Pointed.
Dr. Jha. And I can see that Pedro was nodding because it is something that he has been talking about. But, you know, Pedro, like we've seen everyone responding after the last answer that you gave. And so it's really about people, their homes, children's livelihood, climate, and so much more, right? It's not as organic as, you know, or as technical as a planning process is. So how do you think we can change this approach? We really need to.
Well, let me say that a planning process is not technical, it's political, because you are dealing with the future of a city or a society. And when you're dealing with the future, it's all of us. It's not just the technical guys, so it's political. No? But let me follow the conversation and the discussion, which is very interesting. And let me say, I cannot talk about migration up in India, no, because I don't know enough to that. But I know a lot about migration in Europe, no? And you have two types of migration, from rural to urban, and then from certain areas, which are low income, low GDP to higher GDP. From rural to urban, you will never be able to stop it. And if you stop it, you stop the development of India. Because cities are much more productive than the rural. Normally, in countries which are developed, the metropolises are 30% more productive than the rural. In countries that do not work, like Guatemala, it's 400%. You are 400% more productive in Guatemala City than in any other village in the country. And development means that 70%, 75%, 80% of the population are in cities because they are much more productive. And that is what brings development. And the rural areas do not need so much people, because if you develop the rural areas to have the people increase their income and to have a dignified income, you provide capital and you provide technology. So you are able, a single person is able to run 5 hectares instead of 1, and then you don't need 4 people that go to the cities. And even if these people that go to the cities go to slums, the cities provide not only productivity. Generally, a rural that goes to a city increases the productivity by 20. No? But it's not only productivity, it's as well hope. He might be in a slum, but he hopes that his child will be able to have another type of job and so on. And you cannot stop that. And if you stop that, you stop development. What is different is the migration from one area of the country which has a low productivity, low efficiency, low GDP per capita, to ones which are, and that's the attraction of Mumbai or New Delhi and so on, compared to the Ganges River, no, your west coast, compared to the Ganges River with a lot of population, low GDP, and then they move to the other areas. That obviously the only way of balancing that, apart from what Dr. Jha mentioned very rightly, which is creating a system of cities, not only the 6 big ones, but a system of cities, is by investing in those places. And if the private sector does not like to invest in those sectors because there is no infrastructure, there is no commercial networks, there is no way of making money in places where there is not already money, and that's part of the economy, that's the economies of scale, and you cannot go against that. If the private sector doesn't want to invest, it's the public sector that has to make the investments and the policies to bring activity to those areas. And obviously that's part of the capacity of the public sector to produce. And if you are in the situation that you are in India with 13% of public sector, you will never be able to have a public sector that is able to produce that. And I'm coming to something that Dr. Jha mentioned, no? That there is never going to have, never going to be money enough to deal with the slums and to provide for free housing to these people. Look, when you do a housing plan, you structure the demand, and you structure the demand in 4 categories. The real demand, the ones that the guys that have the money, you don't need to help them at all. The potential demand, the guys that can, with a bit of help, can have the houses. The insufficient demand, which needs a lot of help, 50% of the value of the house. Generally, you provide that by giving them the land and then they build the house. And then the inexistent demand, which is the slums. I have not made the calculations for India, but I have done that for Chad. A public policy that will solve the problems of the inexistent demand, insufficient demand, and potential demand, the amount in Chad is 5% of the oil revenue of Chad. So many of those policies of housing, if they are not solved, is not because there is not money enough, it's because the politicians have other priorities than to solve the problem of housing. And that is a problem. And so let me comment on what Professor Bieder mentioned, that obviously the informal settlements are much more creative than the formal ones, because they are the proof that the formality doesn't work. The formality has not been able to allow for that, and then the creativity happens in those places. But she mentioned something as a bad part of the formal, and let me go back to that. She mentioned speculative processes and how the formal sector is able to grab the value of the land created in those areas and so on. That's what in governance we call the informal side of governance, and call it in another way, you can call it corruption. But if there is corruption in the governance and the way of grabbing the added value of products of other people, do not throw the baby, just throw the water, as the English say. You cannot say we should not have more formal sector because they are corrupt. Avoid the corruption. And in Guatemala, when they have 10% of the budget, sorry, the national budget is only 10% of the economy. And I tell them, if you don't reach 30%, you will never go to anywhere. They tell me, why should we increase the public budget? For the politicians to steal it, to rob it? And I say, well, it's a different problem. Throw the water, not the baby. If you don't control the politicians and then you decide not to increase your public budget to be able to address all those needs of infrastructures, of housing, of environment, and so on, you will never develop. And you see many countries in developing situations that are neither able to control the corruption of the politics, nor the capacity of the public sector to perform their duties to provide those services to the population. And that's why informality exists.
Thank you so much, Pedro, for responding and adding so much, adding the Chad example for us. I will have to go to the question and answer session. We are done with the 50 minutes of panel discussion. And since we are on the topic of politics and Dr. Bhide, I think you will be able to take this question on, something that has been discussed very often on looking at slum dwellers as political vote banks. And so there's a question by Bhaskar which says that, if you do want to reduce slums, let the Election Commission clarify that votes can be cast by people who have a legal address and not by squatters on public land. The squatters would continue to enjoy voting rights in the place they came from. Once politicians lose the vote bank creation, they will lose much interest in creating and abetting slums. I'm sure you have an opinion on this. And you have a story to tell us.
Yes, I do. A few years ago, there was a public interest litigation in the High Court of Mumbai, which expressed a very, very similar sentiment, saying that slum dwelling and staying in a slum is an illegal act, a criminal act, and therefore such persons should not be voters. They should not be given a voting right. Okay? There is very clearly a recognition that the voting right is also being recognized as a currency in many ways. This is what politicians do as well. But I think what this kind of a question misses entirely is that a city is not just about voting, right? Here are people who are contributing to the city's economy. They are a productive part of the city's resources. In fact, one of the interesting part is that Professor Ortiz, the slum dwellers in Mumbai are not inexistential demand. Okay? The kind of scales of economies that these have taken. There are studies done which show that lower ends, even in the formal sector, have no option but to stay in slums. Right? So there are Bombay Municipal Corporation employees, there are police employees who are also staying in slums. Right? So that's the kind of difference. Now back to this point of voting. Okay? As I said, there are the contribution is a very real contribution to the economy. And if one is talking really about migration and why particular kinds of migration can exist, I think we need to begin to also ask these questions to our own selves. Shirish Patel, a very known expert, had estimated that in the case of Mumbai, every formal sector job is associated with about 9 people who are provided employment as different kinds of service provider to that formal sector persons. To put it in other words, I'm very tempted to use a working by Maria Mies, and who had called this slaves, right? So the productivity of every formal sector employed person in cities like Mumbai is actually dependent on the number of slaves that we carry. People who come to us for ironing, to work in our houses, to look after our children, to wash clothes, from whom we buy vegetables and fresh fish and so on and so forth. So if we start looking at this entire network of people whom we want, and we want to also pay them cheaply, but we want to deny them rights. They should go back, home. It is good, right? We'll send them back to vote where they are. Okay? Send them back to UP, Bihar, if one is wanting to act and convert a son of the soil argument. And then they should be coming every day to serve in our home. And we should not be paying them even minimum wages, right? Is that the way in which this kind of a logic goes? There are several holes that one can poke at it, right? So we need to really think about this link between productive contribution, voting right, citizenship of what. Should we start in India talking about preventing the free right or free right of mobility in the country itself? Let's begin to think about that as well, right?
Thank you, Dr. Bide. Now there is a question from Preeti. I think Dr. Deshinkar, you might want to take this one. She says, when we speak of migration and redevelopment of slums, is there a need for collecting data about these populations to aid policy making? If yes, how do you perceive such data being collected? I think this is a major issue that also came up, during COVID, of lack of data everywhere. So, any response to that?
I mean, I do feel that assessing the scale of the issue is quite important, which means gathering better data. Now, gathering data from informal settlements and informal jobs is very hard. And people have made a number of efforts to do that. Participatory mapping has been a relatively successful approach to this, where the slum dwellers themselves are kind of empowered to collect data about their own community and their neighbors and the outlay of the slum and so on. That backed up with satellite imagery has also been another good approach. And then specific surveys, like in Spark, I know in the 80s, they had done a survey of pavement dwellers, and that was extremely elucidative in terms of telling us, who these people are, where they've come from, like they came from the 100 poorest districts of India or something like that, if I remember correctly. So it's very important actually for understanding who they are, what their vulnerabilities are, and what policy can do about that. So data is very closely linked to policy, but it's a political issue, and I feel that the political commitment to collecting better data has been lacking. And because time and again, it's been put forward by academics, by people working on the ground, that we need better data. But the response has been weak, and it may be partly to do with technical reasons, that we don't have the tools to
can go back we can go to the next question till Dr. Deshankar comes back on. This is directed to Pedro. I think Varun Agarwal says that the increasing migration is from rural areas to in situ census towns and no city status of facilities. How do we ensure that the new proto cities that we create do not fall into the same traps as major cities have right now?
You say in the new cities we create?
Yes.
Well,
The new metropolitan areas that we create, maybe.
no, the metropolitan areas are not new. They are there, they are growing,
yeah, we
and you have to
develop,
manage
which we
them. You
develop.
don't have to create
Yes.
them. No, on the
Right.
contrary, the politicians that do not know how to manage a city or a metropolis and they have a mess in their hands, what they generally propose is new towns, no? Is like you are not able to manage your responsibilities, then you propose something, a dream further on, heaven, no? And that means that you don't know how to manage the metropolises, no? No, obviously we have to have, a metropolis only exists from the last 70 years. So it's a really modern, cities exist for 6,000 years, but metropolis only 70 years. So we really have to create the discipline of managing metropolis, and that is part of that. Like, as this one is probably going to be my last intervention, I want to go back to the data issue, and then another question that I saw that about COVID-19 that I have not
Yes. Yes.
about the data. Generally, technicians that say that they don't have data and that cannot make decisions, it is an excuse to do nothing, no? And data is expensive, and the processes that are going on are so quick that when you get the data 3 years after you ask for it, no, because you have to make a competition, they have to get there. 3 years later, the process is 20% larger. So really the data you are going to get 3 years later is already obsolete to make the decisions that you have to make. So the decisions have to be of a different kind. When you are planning for 20 years, 30 years, you are not shooting a bullet. To shoot a bullet, once the bullet is out of the gun, the bullet has already the trajectory decided. And so if you miss the point, the bullet is going to miss the point. When you plan with such a distance, what you are not is shooting a bullet, you are shooting a missile. And a missile is something that you can calibrate along the way in such a way that you hit the point you want to hit at the end of the trajectory, because you are able to calibrate that trajectory. So for those who require data before making decisions, either I should say that they should resign because they do not dare to make the decisions that are necessary and urgent, but the way is as well to change technically their mind and to make proposals with the data they already have, to make proposals that they know that those proposals are going to be wrong, but you, as long as time goes on, you are able to get more data and to calibrate that proposal to make it find the right target at the end of it. So about data, work with what you have and then produce a policy that will be possible to calibrate. And then as you get along, you will be able to calibrate that policy to get your target as the data comes. COVID-19. Look, I don't know India, but in Europe, we have had pandemics every 80 years since Roman times. The first pandemic that we really know and we have a lot of data was the Juliana pandemic in 546. When the pandemic comes, everyone that can afford leave the city, go to the country houses. Everyone that can afford stays at home and pays the poor ones to do the nasty work. And so the ones that die are the poor, the ill, and the old. No? But after every pandemic, and we already had 20 pandemics in Europe, and sometimes a third of Europe died, a third. If it was a pandemic like that now, it would be 200 million people in Europe dying. That has happened in medieval times. After the pandemic, everyone forgets and comes back as life as it was before. Because life as it was before looks for efficiency, economic efficiency, the highest competitiveness, and so on and so on. And once the pandemic is off, people forget, because human brain is very good at forgetting whatever we don't like. So I am afraid all this hysteria about talking about the pandemic while we are in the pandemic, and that's great, is going to result to nothing, because once the pandemic, and we are seeing already that in some countries, once the pandemic is under control, people do not think anymore about the pandemic. They want to forget. No? And the largest pandemic we have had lately, it was the Spanish flu in 1918. 50 million people died in the world. And the First World War, only 40 million died, and 50 million with the pandemic. The pandemic did not change nothing, did change nothing in economics, in social behavior, and so on and so on. And the First World War changed the whole world in economic, in politics, in the way women were incorporated to production and to society and so on. So a war changes much more in the struggle of balances than a pandemic that everyone wants to forget, because that's the way the human brain works. So I hope that at least the teachings that we got from this pandemic, we will be able to introduce them and to implement them, but I'm afraid we are not going to be.
Thank you, Pedro, for responding to the question that came on the Q&A. Dr. Jha, would you like to come in on the data bit, because even as an administrator, you have really been propagating this, and you have also tried to do something around this on creating a data bank. You want to bring in the whole aspect of data. I think it's so important right now.
Partly it is true that everything cannot depend on data. I agree that there are certain things which are very obvious and you don't need data for that. For instance, we know slums need to be properly housed. Now, you would need data that that slum dwellers need to be provided housing. That is something that is a given. Our cities, of course, Indian cities are very weak on data. And I think proper information gathering for cities is extremely important. That cannot be brushed aside. And data on how revenue is generated, data on how land has been used, GIS data on how land use is panned out. A huge amount of data is required, and people collect data all the time. The only thing is that we have not been able to process this data properly and convert it into information that would allow you to take proper decisions. So I think that is extremely important, because what is happening to you, you should realize it's just as we collect data about our body and we get our lipid profile done, which tells us what is the kind of food that we should eat. Similarly, data has central importance in terms of the decisions that you're going to take for the city. What are the decisions that are needed? What are the decisions that you took wrong? So some amount of data has to be created. The only thing we need to be wary of in a world like ours today is that we should not have information overload, so that you have so much that you can't really digest that and come to reasonable conclusions and decisions. Saili?
Thank you, Dr. Jha. There's a question from Tasneem Mehta, which says that, I think Dr. Bhide, maybe you want to take this, which says that how do you suggest that we give greater agency to enable change and demand rights of slum dwellers?
Now, I don't know how do we, so this we factor is not very clear to me. I'm presuming it is policymakers, okay?
Oh, yes.
Because in my view, uh, just the fact that people form communities, they settle in such harsh conditions of environmental risk that they constantly strive to make things livable, okay? Making infrastructure possible, making life possible there. Even currently in the face of the pandemic, I have seen all kinds of community solutions which are being proffered when there was, I think, a large scale abdication by the state. Okay? Uh, and so this tells me that the agency is already there. Okay? What needs to happen is that perhaps policymakers need to recognize this agency. How do we recognize this agency? Can we have more decentralized forums of decision making itself? Okay. There has been proposals of several kinds to make real decentralization and participatory decision making possible. Okay. We have never entertained them. And I think it is high time that perhaps we begin to recognize that. There is a second option, and which is in terms of enabling people themselves to also make plans, okay? Having and putting some budgets to it. Pune city, for example, has tried a very small example, but a very interesting example of inviting proposals for development, and where the municipal corporation devotes a small part of the city budget for execution of those proposals. Okay. Why don't we do this? Okay. A third part is to actually see and think about how does one improve livability of settlements as an objective. I think again in the face of the pandemic, we actually saw that the municipal corporation of Mumbai, and not just Mumbai, but overall in the state and other cities of India also, the health infrastructure proved the weakest link. There is almost no primary healthcare infra which is available in the entire city. We have much better health infra in rural areas. There is a primary healthcare machinery, but we don't in the cities. There are large scale vacancies there. How do we improve that? It is, I think, well known that water sanitation facilities in all settlements are very, very poor. Okay? So when even propagating rules like frequent hand washing, etc., we don't have the mechanisms for that. And these are parameters of livability here. And I think one needs to, therefore, what I see is there has to be a much greater space for decentralization, for more closer decision making, okay? The acceptance and the recognition of what are the lived realities in several settlements. And I think that would make a space also, I think, in our entire decentralization piece. I think our bureaucracies are also getting much more strengthened than the political wing. What one saw is today, in the name of the pandemic, local politics and local councillors are actually not given any space at all. And this is the space actually within the system which was given in Kerala. One of the reasons for why things worked in cities of Kerala is also this, that they have a good primary healthcare infrastructure in their cities. They have a large scale voluntary plus statutory workforce which is available. And the third is that the local councillors were given a due space within the entire decision-making process, including responses to the pandemic.
Thank you, Dr. Bhide. I'm now going to take one last question, which I will direct to Dr. Deshinkar. Krishna Kotak says that with the dual mirror tragedies of COVID-19 and migrant workers crisis, would the nexus of politics, officialdom or babudom as it's called, and economic mafia be forced to be break up?
Wow, that's a difficult one to answer actually, because that nexus is very, very powerful. And like we have heard references to slum lords and the dadas and so on, and they do have political connections. So as Dr. Bhide says, the now increasingly everything in the city is mediated through people like that. So I don't know that this shock that COVID has delivered will make a dent in those arrangements unless the government steps up its game and provides more resources for delivering services, because these people are filling a gap. The dadas and other people are there because the state is not reaching the people it needs to reach, is not providing the resources to actually take services to the people. So that gap is being filled by intermediaries. I mean, we saw this when migrants were going home as well. The Shramik trains were inaccessible, other modes of transport were not easily accessible, and a whole new industry of brokers and intermediaries appeared. So, we can't really criminalize them without understanding why they're there in the first place. And if we want to make a dent in that system, we need to actually be asking questions on how we can improve the delivery of services that government has, whether more resources are needed, as Pedro's saying, and how we can make the state more accountable. So I think we need to amplify the voices of people, recognize their agency, as Dr. Bhide said, and hold the government to account. Then all of this kind of nexus that you're talking about will disappear. It's not going to disappear if you just attack them.
I think that's a great note on which we can end today. And I would like to thank all the panelists, Dr. Bhide, Dr. Jha, Dr. Deshankar, Dr. Ortiz, all my colleagues at ORF who helped us organize this amazing webinar, and all you wonderful participants for being here and with us at the Wednesday webinar. Hope to see you again next time. Thank you, everyone.